Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. This is Dr. Simeon Roger from the Leader Revolution. And I'm going to talk in this video about why Putin's military situation in Ukraine is absolutely dire. So I wanted to give you an update on the conflict in Ukraine, and I promised a video outlining the situation as it really is on the ground and looking at it from the point of view of a military analytical lens. And I think that's very important because it gives us a way forward so we actually know what to expect. I'm going to talk about the political elements in a later video, but I wanted to go through this one. So if you want to know what's going on the ground, stick around. Now, I'm recording this video on March 7th, Monday, March 7th, late in the day. You may not see it until the next day. That's okay. It should be pretty up to date. And much of it is going to be up to date for quite a bit after that. So here we go. Now, the first thing I want to address is this one. How much combat power does Russia have? How much combat power does it actually have? And I want to address this because there's this constant trope in the media that somehow Russia has enormous, unending combat power, and that eventually, no matter what happens, it will get its way. It will crush Ukraine. And this is a flawed analysis, and it's based on perhaps historical memories and an inability to look at the data. So let's look at the Russian ground forces. Okay, this is the land army, the ground forces. It's a branch of the Russian armed forces, and it is the combat power on the ground. Okay, so how large are the Russian ground forces? Well, very simple. About 280,000 active duty personnel. 280,000. That is not enormous. Now, keep in mind the total deployment for the Ukraine operation, the total number of troops that Russia had amassed all around Ukraine prior to the invasion was around 190,000 to maybe 200,000, 200,000 being sort of an upper limit estimate. And that sounds like a lot of people. However, it really isn't, because actual combat troops within that number, probably only about 70 to 80,000. So typically, if you look at the active duty personnel for a military unit and you want to know who are the actual combat troops, you typically have to divide by 3. So actual combat troops, not all that much. If you're looking at 70 to 80,000 combat troops, in terms of the Soviet Union, this would have been 7 to 8 divisions. That's not a lot. The Soviet Union maintained 20 divisions in East Germany alone during the Cold War. This is not a lot. Now, keep in mind, of that 200,000, about 95% have already entered Ukraine. So they have been committed, right? So there's very little in reserve to be committed into Ukraine. And that brings up the whole point. Well, what about reserves? What kind of reserve can the Russian Federation call upon? And part of the problem here is that sometimes when people very quickly Google how big is the Russian army, they get back a figure that says 900,000. The reason they get back 900,000 is that 900,000, or some variant of that, between 900,000 and a little under a million, is the total active duty personnel for all of the Russian armed services, not just for the ground forces. So that includes things that don't really count here. It includes the Air Force, it includes the Navy, it includes the strategic rocket forces, etc. So let's talk, though, about their reserves, because they do have a reserve. They have a 2 million man reserve, roughly. But, and it is a giant but. Okay, it's a giant but. They have a 340,000 roughly National Guard and 170,000 FSB troops, and we'll get to those in a moment. But when you look at the reserve, think about it this way. The reservists are largely people who were one-year conscripts and have done military service, done it a while ago. They've long been out. Yes, they were trained, but their actual involvement with the military is rather minimal. Can these people usefully be called up, brought up, filled into their units? Can they be moved out? Can they actually execute combat tasks in a very contested battlefield? This is highly unlikely. These would be probably fairly good defensive troops if they were defending the motherland. But if you want to send them into another country to fight against a well-prepared force like the Ukrainians, good luck. It's simply more cannon fodder, and it would take a great deal of effort to make it actually transpire. As for the 340,000 troops of the Russian National Guard, the Rosgvardia troops, some of them are already in Ukraine. Okay, but keep in mind, those troops are not full combat troops. They may be useful for occupying territory. And it's true, they are essentially a mix of the old internal troops of the Ministry of the Interior plus some sort of low grade special forces in the sort of like SWAT teams and others. But as for, they're really not full combat troops, and they don't have full combat grade vehicles. As for the 170,000 troops of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, these people are Russia's border troops. You may have noticed Russia has a very long border to patrol. You can't just pull out a lot of people from the FSB or from the National Guard, from Rosgvardia, because these people are needed in the interior of Russia. These people keep order in Putin's rather brittle, increasingly authoritarian regime. So pulling them out, sending them to Ukraine is hazardous. So in other words, when we look at Russia's reserves, it's not a pretty picture. When we look at Russia's total combat power, ground combat power, keep in mind only ground forces can take territory and occupy it. When we look at that, it's not that impressive. This is so not the Soviet army. Not at all. This is not the army that could lose 3 full armies to the Nazi Germans at Kiev at the moment of Hitler's invasion, or very quickly after Hitler's invasion on June 22nd, 1941, and then counterattack at Moscow with an entire Siberian army the Germans didn't even know they had. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not the country anymore that has endless manpower, that could always throw endless manpower at any problem and make it go away by sheer brute force. Much of Russian military planning appears to hinge on the use of brute force still, but they don't have the brute force to be able to execute those tactics anymore. And there are a couple of reasons for this, okay? As I've said here, this is so not the Soviet army because the first thing is, let's look at a map of the Soviet Union. All of the colored area of this map is the old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that fell apart on Christmas Eve, 1991. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Moscow lost control of 1/2 of its population and about 1/3 of its territory, as well as some key industries, etc. But pay attention to the population problem. You've just lost half your population. So in other words, you had this enormous reserve of manpower, which suddenly you were no longer able to call upon. But your military planning didn't necessarily catch up. Now here's the second part of this double whammy, the second part. This is Russia's population projection. You'll notice Russia's population is set to not simply decline, but actually plummet from 140 million in 2010 down to roughly 100 million in 2050. So Russia is facing a demographic disaster of the first order, something that is utterly beyond their ability to reverse. There is nothing that can reverse this fall. And this is already hitting military manpower. It's already making it extremely difficult with their aging population to fill up the ranks of the military. So from the point of view of manpower to fix your problem in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, I'm sorry, you simply don't have it anymore. So how much combat power? Well, all of this means that Russia still has a lot of brute force on its side, yes, but not nearly as much as most commentators seem to assume. And it's not going to fix the problem in Ukraine. Russia does not have enough combat power to take and hold all of even eastern Ukraine. So if we look at even the eastern part of Ukraine, they simply can't do it, and we'll look at a map a little bit later on. Therefore, there is really no scenario in which this works out as anything other than a total fiasco for the Kremlin. Another problem, the resistance did not split as Putin thought. So the resistance to the invasion did not split along ethno-linguistic lines, as Putin thought it would. He thought the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine would easily welcome him and, welcome them with flowers and etc., etc. Because a lot of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine actually speaks Russian. Even in Kiev, most people actually communicate in Russian rather than Ukrainian. And that's okay. However, the The population did not split along these ethno-linguistic lines at all. Most of the resistance to the Russian army, most of the resistance they've faced to date, has come from dominantly Russian-speaking areas because those are the areas they have primarily invaded. And this may be what's driving Putin so nuts about the city of Kharkiv. It's basically a Russian city, and it's fighting to the death, and it's beating the crap out of the Russians. So, and I have myself watched endless interviews with Ukrainian soldiers of various types since, long before this current invasion, but as well endless interviews also in the past couple of weeks, as you can well imagine. And because I know these languages, I actually speak Russian fluently. My Ukrainian, yeah, oh well. But at least I know a lot of Ukrainian and I can easily recognize it. What I can tell you absolutely for sure, and much of the media misses this point, that most of the Ukrainian soldiers, or I'd say at least 50% that I've heard in interviews, 50% at least, are giving their answers when they're interviewed. They're giving their answers in Russian rather than Ukrainian. Why is that? Well, simply because they're probably a little more comfortable with Russian, or it's more natural to them. Most of them will speak both languages, by the way. And you'll hear a lot of Ukrainians, all the way from President Zelensky himself down to people on the street who will, they'll speak Ukrainian to a Ukrainian audience, and then they'll suddenly decide they have a message for the Russian people, and they'll switch into absolutely perfectly fluent Russian. Very, very common. It's a highly bilingual area. So what this means is the nexus of allegiance for the people of Ukraine has shifted from ethno-linguistic to political lines. So even though many of these people are Russian speakers, primarily Russian speakers, they identify with Ukraine as a state, and they identify with what Ukraine is fighting for. And they identify themselves, more importantly, as Ukrainians. So much for Putin's plan of causing an ethno-linguistic split in Ukraine, which itself, this creates an impossible situations for Moscow war planners because it means everybody's against them. And a typical barricade near the Kiev region, it says, Добро пожаловать в ад, часть 2. Welcome to hell, part 2. Why part 2? I actually don't know. I've seen another one that just says welcome to hell. So maybe this one's just farther down the road. Anyway, there we go. So it means everybody is against him. And the unity among Ukrainians is almost 100%. The second factor inhibiting Putin's military adventure is the bungling incompetence of the Russian army, inexplicable bungling incompetence, such as we have not seen from the modern armed forces since I don't know. So this is the town of Bucha near Kiev, and this is a Russian column that was ambushed by the Ukrainians. And you can see here, well, you can't see here because it's really so bad. There are endless trucks, transport vehicles of various types that have been wrecked, armored personnel carriers, BMPs, etc., IFV, infantry fighting vehicles, and on it goes. Now, the problem with this is what it shows. This is the result of not implementing force protection. The Russians were trying to move a large force through this area, but they didn't have any idea that they were under threat until it was all over. This clearly means they had no concept of force protection, and they've been doing this all over the country. They're getting ambushed everywhere. And every day is a litany of new videos showing scenes just like this one in different places. So what this means is that the Russian army is not terribly competent in actual combat operations. Keep in mind, they have very little combat experience. Very little of the Russian army was actually ever committed in the Syrian conflict. So they really didn't come away with a lot of combat experience from there. The Chechen conflict, that was a while ago. Some people are still around who have combat experience from that. But compared to the armed forces of the United States, for example, the Russians are not experienced. At this juncture, at least. Then, of course, there's the convoy, aka the traffic jam. This line of vehicles, some 60 to 65 kilometers long, 40 miles long, heading from the frontier with Belarus down to Kiev. And the distance between the Belarusian border and Kiev is only about 70 odd 80 kilometers. It's not far. It's less than a day's drive. It's less than a tank of gas, even for a main battle tank. And yet, this Russian convoy, as we can see, it's a hopeless traffic jam, sometimes three abreast like this. What we have been seeing is that the people in this convoy often they're running out of food or they're running out of fuel. Often they're leaving their vehicles because they don't feel safe in their vehicles. They're camping in the woods. Sometimes the vehicles are not well maintained, so they're just breaking down on their own. And most of this convoy has actually been stuck now for a little over a week. And as they're stuck, they're also being picked off by Ukrainians. So it is a terrible, untenable situation. Whether they are going to be able to, well, actually just to back up and get the convoy out of there and let it head back to Belarus would be a major logistical operation. It would probably take another week if someone competent were running it. So this is a symptom of total logistical collapse. You cannot invade successfully any piece of territory unless you have the logistics to do it. Logistics are everything. As it's often said, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk about logistics. And this is just a demonstration of that. So we have Russian units running out of food, running out of fuel, running out of water, and they're unable to get the supplies to the frontline troops at all. Then there's the failure of Russia's much vaunted air defenses. So Russia's air defenses have not fared well here. This is a video from a Ukrainian drone, probably one of the Turkish drones. And what it's doing here, what it's targeting, you'll see on the left, are surface-to-air missile launchers. Specifically, this is a Buk M2, or in NATO parlance, surface-to-air missile number 17, NATO codename Grizzly. And these two launch vehicles for the Buk 2 system are being targeted by the drone. They're being blown to bits. Now, if you do not know military equipment, you may not be aware of the fact that Russia has poured an unbelievable amount of effort into propaganda worldwide about the incredible effectiveness of its high-tech air defense. All elements of its high-tech air defense, they've been really, really pushing this, how systems like Pantsir S and the S-400 series are the best surface-to-air systems out there, the best protection that money can buy. And yet they can't fend off a drone. And they can't seem to ground the Ukrainian Air Force either. So this is the other part of it. So they simply aren't able to protect themselves adequately from threats from the air. And what we've seen is some Russian battalion groups apparently outrunning their supply lines and leaving their own integral air defense units behind. And as they do this, they leave themselves wide open. So there's the Buk M2 system, the one that was destroyed, of exactly the same type at least. And the other part of that is, despite overwhelming numerical advantage, Russia has not been able to establish air superiority, much less air supremacy. So we're finding Ukrainian aircraft are still operating, sometimes shooting down Russian aircraft, and the Russian aircraft are unable to suppress Ukrainian air defense. So Ukrainian air defense is busy taking them down, like it took down this Ka-52 attack helicopter, like it took down this Sukhoi Su-34 fullback fighter bomber. In other words, Ukrainian air defense is still very potent. The Russians have to worry about it. The Russian Air Force does face threats in the air, but also from the ground. Then there's the crisis of morale, which is unbelievable. So in this photo, you see the young Russian soldier, and some Ukrainian women are helping him, just giving him some refreshments after he surrenders, and donating a cell phone so he can call his mother. And this is a scene repeating itself constantly throughout the different areas of Ukraine today. And the Russian soldiers are saying that they're confused, that they've been lied to, that they're being used as cannon fodder, which is absolutely true. These people are nowhere near ready. Most of them are saying they're one-year conscripts. They're also saying that they were told they were on exercises. They weren't even told they were going into combat. And they were told the Ukrainians would, they would welcome us with flowers. Well, there's a big difference between a javelin missile and a flower, as the Russians are finding out. So you can't run a modern army on 1-year conscripts, by the way. 1 year is not nearly enough time to turn somebody into a competent soldier in terms of using modern equipment, understanding modern tactics, and executing everything properly. It can't be done. And yet, many of these people seem to be conscripts, which is kind of a surprise. We know that Russia has been moving toward a more professional armed forces, but they still have a draft, they still have conscription. Most modern armies have switched to a fully professional force, and not surprisingly, they're therefore much better able to execute combat operations. So this crisis of morale, and we see a bunch of different Russian soldiers here who've been taken prisoner or surrendered. What this leads to is the danger that the army disintegrates around the edges, and it already is. It's already disintegrating around the edges because sometimes these guys, people like this, what are they doing? Well, they're desperate to get out of this horrible situation. So they're sometimes sabotaging their own vehicles. They're sometimes abandoning their own vehicles, and they're surrendering. So there is a danger that the army can disintegrate completely. Now that's an extreme scenario. It may not happen, but if I were planning this, if I were planning for the Russian military, I'd be very concerned about this, because the danger is that officers and entire units will start to surrender en masse, or worse, they will defect. They will simply start fighting for the Ukrainians. They will donate their equipment and their efforts to the Ukrainians. And the reason they would do that is because they realize that they've been had. They realize they've been lied to. They realize they're not there to overthrow a Nazi regime, because there isn't one, etc. However, another thing to consider is the reason Ukraine is doing so well on the battlefield is not simply because it's running into people who don't know how to fight and who didn't think they were going to fight, because Ukraine repeatedly defeats elite Russian units too. So Russia's elite airborne forces, the VDV, have been unable to take and hold Hostomel Air Base near Kiev for nearly 2 weeks. We're nearly 2 weeks into the invasion, and the VDV still can't seem to secure Hostomel. It's absolutely amazing. And Ukrainian troops have repeatedly defeated the VDV, as evidenced by the large number of destroyed and captured BMD vehicles. So the BMD is an infantry fighting vehicle specifically for the airborne troops. They're the only users of this vehicle. And yet these things are being destroyed and captured everywhere. The VDV is being widely used by the Russians, probably because it is an elite force, but it may be being misused or put into situations where it cannot really do very well. And it's not simply the VDV, but if we talk about Russian elite units, obviously we have to talk also about their special forces, about the so-called Spetsnaz. So Spetsnaz, meaning Specialne Nazначение, just means a special designation. That's a generic designation for the Russian special forces. So nor do Spetsnaz, Special Operations Forces, or Wagner Group mercenaries, their infiltration teams, seem to have had any measurable effect. We've seen lots of attempts to infiltrate, attempts at, in other words, sabotage, assassination, this kind of thing. But these teams do not seem to have had any significant success. It has certainly been tried in the Kiev region and probably elsewhere, but it doesn't seem to be working. The next problem is that Putin's losses are at unsustainable levels. Unsustainable. Here are the approximate Russian losses as of the time of this video. Now, there's going to be a little bit of detail here. And if you don't understand military equipment, it may be more detail than you want. If you do understand military equipment, it's probably less detail than you want. Well, too bad. So here we go. So far, as of right now, the Russians have probably lost about 300 main battle tanks. That means essentially T-72B variants, T-80s, both B variants and U variants, and T-90As. They've lost, get this, about 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. So when we talk about infantry fighting vehicles, mainly the BMPs and BMDs, armored personnel carriers, the BTRs, and various MTLB variants. They have had about 11,000 troops killed. So about 11,000 troops dead, and therefore we can expect at least a similar or greater number of wounded. 120 multiple rocket launchers of various types like Grad, Smerch, Uragan, possibly the dreaded TOS-1, which is their thermobaric rocket launcher. Roughly 50 surface-to-air missile systems, and I threw down the NATO designations for them here just to make it easy. Various types, SA 8, 9, 13, 11, 15, 17, blah, blah, blah. If you understand military equipment, you'll know what those designations mean. And I just didn't put the Russian designations in just to save space. Roughly 45 aircraft, that's fixed-wing aircraft, ordinary aircraft, not including helicopters, Su-24 swing-wing fighter bombers, Su-25 frogfoot ground attack aircraft, Su-30 and 35 air superiority fighters, both variations of the flanker, Sukhoi's flanker, the Su-34 fullback fighter bomber, and they have lost at least one, probably two IL-76 transports, which were transporting VDV troops at the time. Most of those losses are attributable to ground fire, surface-to-air missile fire from the ground. Some are attributed to the Ukrainian Air Force in actual air-to-air engagements. 65 helicopters, MiL Mi-8 or 14 transport helicopters, Mi-24 helicopter gunships, Ka-52 Kamov helicopter gunships, and various things like that. So, plus 500 other vehicles, absolute minimum 500 other vehicles. So, in other words, what Russia has lost here is well over a complete division in terms of equipment. In fact, vastly more in terms of equipment and a little bit more in terms of actual troops. So what this means is you're 2 weeks into an invasion. Think about it, 2 weeks into an invasion, you have about 180,000 troops in the country. You've already lost, probably conservatively, you've lost 20,000 of them. 20,000 at least, maybe more, 20 to 30,000 have been incapacitated. So, because they're either dead or wounded or captured. That is not going well, especially when you've captured so little territory and you have captured only one Ukrainian city, Kherson, in the south. Others you've surrounded or you've been besieging for a very long time, and it still hasn't worked. So the losses are at an unsustainable level. It would take years to make up the equipment losses alone, and that's without the sanctions that have trashed the ruble and emptied Putin's war chest. So Putin's roughly $650 billion war chest is inaccessible to him now, thanks to sanctions, and the ruble is useless. But as I said, even without that, the Russian economy would take years to replace the losses they've had already. In a week from now, Russian casualties will have equaled in just 3 weeks the lives lost in their 10-year war in Afghanistan. Now that war in Afghanistan put considerable political pressure on the Soviet regime. Those losses were a real problem for the regime. So what do you think is going to happen when the Russian population wakes up to the losses that they have suffered in the Ukraine? Significant political pressure at home, and something Putin is probably very afraid of. Another factor is that the only front line is wherever you're standing, and that's not a very comfortable thought. If the only front line is where you're standing, it means your enemy is fighting you asymmetrically. So in other words, there is no front line. What it means is once you're in country, if you're in the Russian army and you're in Ukraine, you are on the front line. You can be attacked anywhere, anytime. Attacked at any moment from any direction. That means no sleep or very little sleep, low morale, therefore, and very poor decision making. In a war with the front, the following vehicles would be very hard to capture. So what we're seeing from the Ukrainians is they're capturing types of vehicles that demonstrate that there is no front line. They're capturing lots of artillery pieces like this 2S3 Akatsi 152 millimeter howitzer. Normally this would be way behind those front lines. The same thing with this Grad multiple rocket launcher. And yet they're capturing or destroying all of these things, which normally would be out of their range. Now, the good thing, of course, is that the Ukrainian government last week assured its soldiers and citizens that if they captured a Russian tank or armored vehicle, they would not have to declare it on income tax. Everyone needs a humorous break in the middle of a war. But it's true, they actually said this. You don't have to declare captured Russian tanks on your income tax. So this farmer, and you can see the wheel of his tractor on the right, he's towing away a Russian armored vehicle. And, he's a farmer, so I'm betting he's thinking, wow, look what I found. I found this thing. It's going to make a great tractor for my farm. He may not realize that box on top is full of surface-to-air missiles, that he's pulling away a Tor surface-to-air missile system. Then there's the financial cost of the war, enormous. Other than the near total destruction of the Russian economy, the imminent collapse of the standard of living, and the loss of most personal savings, the war is costing about 21 billion US dollars per day, money which Putin cannot afford for long. In other words, factors such as Russia's lack of combat power reserve, the political rather than ethno-linguistic alignment of the Ukrainians, the bungling incompetence of the Russian army at every turn, the Russian army's accelerating crisis of morale, Ukraine's demonstrated ability to defeat even elite Russian units, the unsustainable level of Russian losses, the lack of a front line and the asymmetric nature of the conflict, and the financial cost will all converge to make a long war less likely, but more disastrous for the Kremlin. So the longer Putin stays in Ukraine, the worse off he will be. He's proving extremely stubborn. He seems to want to persist in this misadventure, and I won't get into what people are saying about his probable state of mind at the moment. We'll look at political factors and the psychological ones in a different video, but just from what you can see here, the longer he stays, the worse off he is. And finally, we have a map. So, many people are saying, well, Kiev is going to definitely be surrounded and be taken. You'll see the blue arrow pointing to Kiev. I'll believe that when I see it. So far, that column coming down from the north from Belarus has been unable to do anything useful. There are forces coming in, as you can see, from the northeast. Will they actually be able to surround the city? Even if they do, will they be able to prevent a breakout or prevent supplies getting in? And even if they do, will they have enough combat power left to take the city? Now, urban combat is devastating to an advancing army. If they go into Kiev and try to take it from the Ukrainians, they will suffer unbelievable losses. They may just try to surround it, starve it out, cut it off. But even then, even if Kiev were to fall, even if the Ukrainian government were to fall, Putin's misadventure is going to backfire eventually. Now, this line, the yellow line along the Dnieper River, is basically the division of East and West Ukraine. Now, the western part of Ukraine is actually much larger. It goes much farther to the left of your screen than you see on this map. But as you can see, after 2 weeks of war, Russia has made very little headway overall into even the eastern part of Ukraine. Its ability to take this territory and hold it is dubious at best. So that's just an overall summary of this. And what it all means is that the longer Putin stays in Ukraine, the worse off he is. Okay, watch out for our next video. We're going to talk about the political aspect of this and how you deal with the crisis management of this. How do you get out once events have taken on a momentum of their own that you didn't expect? That's it for now. We'll see you later.